The crisis and the banks. How is the financial sector coping? In the interview, President of the Association of German Banks, Andreas Schmitz.
Herr Schmitz, you and the association have recently selected your successor. He'll take over at a difficult time. Debt crisis, euro crisis, sovereign debt crisis, real estate crisis. There seems to be no end in sight. Did you do such a poor job in the last 4 years?
We weren't able to solve these crises, which have been smouldering for quite some time, but we modernised the association and improved political coordination. From a PR perspective, those things probably aren't momentous. Negotiations were carried out quietly, behind closed doors. But we achieved a lot politically, in both Berlin and in Brussels.
You came under a lot of public criticism. It was said that when the Chancellor sought advice, she went to Deutsche Bank CEO Josef Ackermann rather than to you. Did you have a better relationship with Merkel than you let on, or did Ackermann just have more to say?
Well, as the saying goes, many enemies, much honour. It's fitting that the head of Germany's largest bank has a relationship with the Chancellor and her government. That would be difficult to achieve for the elected head of an association. I can safely say that as the head of the biggest bank in Germany, Mr. Ackermann also has more influence than the presidents of other associations.
Your sector is in the midst of a crisis. Many European banks are standing on the precipice and have only survived with government bailouts. Give us a feel for how bad things really are.
The German banking sector is doing much better than in 2007 or 2008. We've increased capital, we have more liquidity, improved risk management systems, and we've tackled problems in our compensation scheme. A lot has changed in Europe, but there are still massive problems in countries like Spain.
The big banks are planning job cuts in Germany as well. It used to be that employment at a bank meant security. Are those days over?
The banking sector faces huge challenges in terms of costs, but also in terms of revenue. We will certainly employ fewer people in the future than we do today.
Your goal was to improve the reputation of banks. Would you say that you achieved your goal?
No. Many issues have arisen over the last weeks and months and years. We can't solve the crisis in a matter of weeks. It will take a concerted effort over a period of years to achieve that.
Still, bankers remain scapegoats for the nation and for the world, especially investment bankers earning big money. Do you think reform efforts have been successful?
Yes, because of the compensation systems banks have in place now. German banks, at least, do not allow the sorts of streams of compensation we saw in the past. I also want to make clear that of the 650,000 employees in the German banking industry, only a very small percentage profited from this compensation system. The generalized criticism of banks simply does not apply to 99% of employees, some of whom are now being demonized by politicians.
In Germany, there is really only one bank that is a big international player, Deutsche Bank. Is that enough for Germany as an export nation?
Germany and its banking sector would be well advised to develop one or two or three other major banks. I would say the international nature provides support for German mid-sized companies and industries on the world market. That's a competitive advantage when you can rely on your domestic banks and not on foreign players.
You represent some 200 banks. All of them are competing for lucrative mid-sized companies. Are there enough customers to go around?
Not all 200 banks are concentrated on mid-sized companies. It's actually less than a fourth of the banks. That's good news for those companies when there's competition for their banking business. They'll be well taken care of. But every bank has to ask itself if its business model and its comparative advantages are enough to guarantee success.
Then there's also the individual customer who's occupying center stage more and more. But they've been largely ignored for years. Since investment banking isn't going that well anymore, focus is moving towards individuals. Is that lucrative for a bank?
I don't entirely share your view that the individual customer has been ignored. It depends on the company's business model. If you targeted small to medium firms or retail as the core of your business, you were ultimately servicing individuals. But when you look across all sectors of the banking industry, private banking isn't particularly profitable, and that's just a fact. That illustrates our willingness to provide services and the quality and cost-effectiveness of what we offer our customers. You have to look at other countries and how they do banking there, especially for retail and private customers.
There's been a demand recently to divide the banking system into separate consumer banking and investment banking entities. Why have you opposed the idea of dividing these branches so one doesn't have to back risks associated with the other?
This is primarily a political demand, which is partly for show. No one has convinced me that this will usher in greater stability. The universal banking model has proven to be successful in Europe over the past few decades. I also think German small to medium enterprises and the German economy needs a universal banking system like we have at the moment. It has always worked well, and that's something that the financial wing of German business is in agreement with.
The financial crisis teaches us that we need banking supervision in Europe. When is this going to happen?
We hope it will happen, preferably sometime next year or at the beginning of 2014. But diligence takes precedence over speed here. The right conditions must be in place, and hopefully lawmakers will take their time. But we're certainly fighting for a European banking supervisor. We think that's the right approach.
There are also calls for banks to ensure they have enough equity to back commercial activities. Internationally, there's disagreement with the European standpoint. The U.S. refuses to support the Basel III regulatory standard. That means the Americans would get to do as they please, and you would have increased operating costs.
This statement that the Americans won't implement Basel III, I don't think it's been settled yet. There are signs that they may do it. If Europe goes it alone and implements Basel III and America doesn't, it would be a serious competitive imbalance. That's why we're also saying that those American institutions that operate here in Europe have to play by the same rules that we do.
We can talk all we like about regulating banks, but when there are shadow banks around the world which disperse huge sums of money all over the globe, I'm talking about investment funds and other large financial concerns, if they're not regulated, then it's of little significance, isn't it?
The G20 made a decision in Pittsburgh that there are to be no financial players and no financial products without appropriate oversight and regulation. We fully support this. That's why we favour the shadow banking sector being subject to the same rules that will eventually apply to competition between banks. We can't have a situation where one section of the market is strictly regulated and another takes a laissez-faire approach. That would lead to a distortion and increased risk.
We come now to the eurozone debt crisis, particularly southern European countries like Greece. There are discussions about a debt write-off for Greece, so that public creditors would have to relinquish the money that they're owed. Do you think this will happen?
The southern European countries have done a lot to improve their competitiveness. That's evident from the initial figures. They need time to implement these measures. That requires our support. What the issue of a debt write-off involves is the question of whether all possible measures have been exhausted, because debt reduction can only be used as a last resort. That's where I say there are measures that could still be applied.
We've been going around in circles for months. Greece is running out of money and needs more.
Yes, that's right. That's why I'm hoping that we find a definitive solution which everyone supports and that the Greeks finally complete the work that they've undertaken.
What are the arguments against a debt write-off?
There are no arguments against it because it really is a last resort. A debt write-off might make investors wonder whether it could happen in other countries. Before it gets to that stage, you need to have exhausted all other measures. And we haven't done that yet.
Politicians fear that at some point Northern and Central Europeans will no longer be willing to pay for Southern Europeans. Do you share those fears?
There certainly is a risk that at some point the protests in front of the Greek parliament in Athens could be accompanied by protests in front of the Bundestag in Berlin, protests against subsidies to the southern states. That's why it's important politically to present this process very transparently. We're doing that. We must also make it clear that maintaining the eurozone and the euro as a common currency is a key feature not only of European integration, but also for the economic well-being of this country.
If anyone knows the answer to this, it's you. Will the euro still exist in all eurozone countries in 10 years?
We bankers also have our limits. Recent years have shown a lot about our powers of prediction, so let me put it differently. I certainly hope that in 10 years the euro is still around and all the countries remain in the EU or the eurozone.
In 4 months, Jürgen Fitschen of Deutsche Bank will take over your post. What will he have to tackle during his 3 years in office?
Well, I reject the allegation that I've left things undone. I really can't see that. But it is a continual effort to strengthen trust in the credit services sector, or even to lay a new foundation for it. That's certainly not something that Mr. Fitschen can do all by himself. He'll have to rely on help from all of the banks in the association, as well as the other pillars of the credit services sector.
Thank you, Mr. Schmitz.
You're welcome.